Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. Interesting to see you again after a week that's been unusual in many ways.
Every week is unusual in many ways.
Rather than talk about what's been on most people's minds and most people's screens over the last week relating to the nomination for the Supreme Court, I think there's something else is much more interesting in the long term, and it has to do with the cultural problems of globalization.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that, and actually I should say to begin with, the reason I'm talking about this is that a group of people from the music industry in England apparently wrote a letter to the Prime Minister yesterday complaining about Brexit because they say it's going to ruin the British music industry. Now, who would have thought that that would be a problem and that it would be something that the government would have to take notice of? But when you think about it, the history of music is very interesting because music as we know it today really only started in the 18th century with Bach and Scarlatti and people like that it's first in Italy and then in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And then things began to get significant also musically in England and France. But pop music, well, jazz began at the beginning of the 20th century, I suppose, in America. And pop music might have begun in America, but it was what America was doing in the 50s was superseded by what began to start, what started in England in the late 50s and mainly the 60s.
Right.
I remember when I came back to England in 1963 and everybody was listening to the Beatles, which I'd never heard of before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, apparently since then, the British music industry has been the pop music industry, I suppose is what we have to call it, has been the most, has been dominant in world music. And it's so that there's an enormous amount of interaction going on between what is done musically in England and and people's interest in music in the rest of Europe. And all these connections are likely to be broken by a hard Brexit.
Well,
now,
are the connections? Well, let me ask you a couple of questions. I mean, there are obviously financial connections insofar as putting together record or music productions, licensing rights, selling of royalties, things of that nature. But the quote unquote connections insofar as the interest of listeners to the product, are the artists claiming that too would be affected by a hard Brexit?
well, I'm not, since I haven't read the letter, I'm not sure it's exactly what they're most concerned about. But I immediately saw it in the context of what's going on culturally in globalization generally. And the way, I mean, globalization we've always been treating as though it's an increasing amount of interaction over larger and larger areas between people who are more and more different from each other. So globalization really is a process of cultural homogenization to some extent, because people are getting to understand what goes on in different cultural communities. However, it produces problems. And it's very difficult to predict where the problems are going to arise. Brexit, obviously, is a cultural problem. People who voted for Brexit voted to leave the European Union because of the way they felt that immigration into England was changing the English way of life, which people were very comfortable with. At the other end of the world, or the other end of the main land combination of continents in China. China is doing all sorts of things now which get a bad press because they don't want people promoting a completely different cultural form of life, especially in the Northwest among the Uyghur and the parts of China that were only included into the modern political
just recently,
territory in the beginning of the 18th century. And you can find things like this going on in other parts of the world as well. So the process of globalization has become a process of cultural expansion, but also cultural conflict. And it's very difficult to see how it's going to continue in the rest of what's coming in the rest of this century. Whether in fact the cultural conflicts, and of course there are much more serious ones than that in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, whether they're actually going to be sorted out or whether they're going to become more get into the way of globalization much more than they have so far.
You know, I may have overlooked music and culture in general, but let's focus on music since you mentioned it as a little bit of a DNA packet for transmission of globalization interest, if you will, that crosses borders, crosses cultures with impunity, pays no heed to boundaries. And I'm just thinking offhand of a couple of different things. Last night at a Major League Baseball stadium up in New York City, where the Mets play, a South Korean boy band of 15-year-olds attracted some 35,000 people, many of whom were young teenage girls, American girls, who had slept outside for 4 days and nights in front of the stadium to buy tickets. And I had seen them interviewed on the local TV news, and they admitted candidly they couldn't understand the language. They were just infatuated with the music and, of course, with the young men. And we've seen this tendency frequently on Facebook and other social digital platforms where there are links of videos of people from Argentina or from Asia or from Europe singing, and these links are reshared tens of thousands of times around the world. So it's very interesting. I mean, we always talk about how nation states and the like are trying to protect their borders and maintain their sovereignty. But I think throughout history, as long as we can record it, music at least has been able to jump boundaries and does so with impunity. And so in some ways, these artists are probably thinking, my goodness, I mean, this is our cultural right as musicians and as creators of music. And now you're going to do what? You're going to build a wall, restricting our access to the continent and to the rest of the world. And I can see their point, but I would also suggest to them that they need not worry, because there's no boundary that the British government is going to be able to build that's going to be high enough to hem that music into Britain only.
But the point is, I think that anything that is mainly a cultural force, in which the economics is determined by what happens culturally, is uncontrollable.
I agree.
Which really goes against most of the things that people generally think about globalization, which is that it's primarily economic. And of course, it probably did start with the expansion of trade originally, but a very long time ago. And it was trade that carried culture. Now we have international trade anyway, and what's moving culturally is quite independent of that.
It's quite independent of that, and it also it doesn't seem to need or rely on any one vehicle of transmission. It's that's I'm trying to I'm a little bit surprised because we're both amateur musicians, or I should say, amateur, whatever the right adjective you want to use, and I'm a little bit surprised. I'm sitting here and the computer is on my piano. I'm surprised that in these many meetings that we have, it's never dawned on me that music itself is something that has always been one of the best examples of globalization that exists. It existed before globalization, perhaps even existed in some ways. So I'm going to have to ponder this a little bit, but it's interesting because you can't really restrict it. And
Oh, I think music is an excellent example of this, but there are other things that move in a way that is not controllable in the same way that music does. For example, language.
hmm hmm
The way languages have been becoming extinct, and other languages, so that there's now the number of languages in the world has diminished from 7,000 odd to 5,000 or so at most,
hmm
and now in the last 50 years. And some languages keep expanding, and English seems to keep spreading much more than anything else, despite what some people in some countries would like to happen. For example, when it's very interesting that it was the expansion of the British Empire to begin with that spread English, and now the Chinese are the most active foreigners in Africa. They're all working in English, not in Chinese.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So Chinese is not being spread,
hmm
and presumably that's because so many Chinese have already learned English,
Good point. Right.
and English is the main second language in Africa.
hmm hmm
No, I mean, I'm amazed all the time that the number of students who come to me who've never been out of China before and have just turned up in America, and they speak perfect English.
It's amazing.
And the same thing happens with students who come from Iran.
hmm
Whereas these two languages, which have a longer history of literacy and organized, what should I say, bureaucratic and administrative usage than English.
Persian and Chinese, right, right. Well, it's. Go ahead. Excuse me.
So I was just going to say that there's several examples like this that one can point to that shows that we can't control the way the world is coming together, because the main factors are factors that aren't controllable, like the spread of the appeal of certain new types of music, and the spread of language use.
Well, it's interesting that I'm presuming that the likes of Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Sting, and others might have signed such a letter that you referred to. I'm going to go investigate that after I get off. But it's interesting to think that it was they who discovered this, and not discovered, but who recognized the power of their medium to cross borders, cross cultures, and wanted to make sure that was preserved. That's whereas, in fact, I, who have been having these discussions with you over these months and years, never quite picked up on that. So, very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Professor, go ahead.
Are we at the end of our time?
We could go a little more, of course.
I was going to say that it's we've always been thinking that it was the people who were moving that were spreading things, but it's not. It's no longer the people that are the main force. It's the cultural factors which move irrespective of the movement of people.
Well, this is true, and I mean it extends to literacy, it extends to music, it extends to ideas, it probably extends to religion, a whole host of things that add up to the cultural factors that move across borders and things without being stopped.
Well, religion in the past has been one of the major factors. So, I mean, the spread of Christianity, the spread of Islam, and even the spread of Buddhism have been really major factors in the spread of cultural understanding.
Right.
But religion isn't working that way anymore, and other things are taking its place.
Well, on that note, let's adjourn until next week. All right,
Okay.
Professor Stewart, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.